and welcome to this week's YouTube video. This week I'm going to show you layer 2 of this fox painting. Before we get into the painting, I wanted to show you a quick roadmap of the colours and temperatures of this fox. If you look at this painting, you'll see that we have 4 areas that are obviously different. If you are struggling to see these, then squint down at the original reference photo that I put a link to in the item description. Squinting down removes detail and gives you obvious areas to focus on. So here I have areas 1, 2, 3 and 4. Within those areas, the temperature shifts in the following way: warm, cool, warm, cool. Remember last week that I showed you the colour mixes that I used for a limited palette regarding this painting. I showed you orange and blue colour mixes and also green and red colour mixes. So on this painting then, broadly speaking, I have used orange and blue colour mixes in this area here. I have used red and green and blue and orange in this area here. But you can see stronger greens in the areas just here and here. This area here, I have used stronger reds, but also some oranges as well. But note, I will always neutralise, even if it's just a trace, with my complementaries. So a tiny bit of green in my red, for example. In this area here, I have used more greens and blues. Finally, this area here is more orange. A further thing to notice is around the eyes, where I have been very heavy with my alizarin crimson. Notice how the areas around the alizarin crimson carry more green. This is because green is a complementary to red. Also, my black is a rich black, and I have mixed it from ultramarine deep, alizarin crimson and cadmium yellow. I have adjusted the individual leaning of the colour depending upon what I have next to it. So for example here it carries more blue because it is next to orange, and then as I move further out of the depths of the shadows into the half shadows, I add more orange. So hopefully if you're attempting to paint this picture yourself, this may give you a little bit more help as to how I used my suggested palette and how to vary the temperatures. So let's get into the painting now, and I will show you layer 2. There may be instances during this painting where I go quiet. Please don't adjust your sound, it's just difficult to talk non-stop for around 18 minutes, which is about the length of the painting time of this video. With each layer, I am trying to get a little closer to what I am seeing. I guess the easiest way to think about it is in terms of incremental steps. So for example, you could try to get 25% closer to the finished painting with each layer. I've done layer 1, so by the time I've done layer 2, I will be aiming to be about 50% towards how I want the painting to be when it's finished. That doesn't mean that 50% of it has to be perfectly painted. I'm working on the painting as a whole. It just needs to be on that linear line progressing towards the finished painting. I'm starting with my most obvious areas. This would be my darkest value areas, or most obvious colour areas. For the dark shadows, I am mixing my rich black, alizarin crimson, ultramarine deep, cadmium yellow. For the area right in the crevice underneath the fox, I am using a rich black that leans more heavily on a blue, because this area is going to be next to a warmer orange. I want that shadow to pop against my fox. Using my colour opposite will help achieve this. As I move into my half shadows, I begin to add a little bit of orange into my rich blacks, plus a little bit of white to lighten it. Remember that you can use both orange, yellow or yellow ochre light to lighten your rich black. White on its own will knock out your chroma, so always be aware when adding white you may need to add colour into your mix. I am also using a very dry brush to add this paint. I am not allowing my paint to flow freely. I want it dry and almost scummy because it makes it easier to add paint over the top. So I'm using a very old tired brush where the bristles are very splayed out to do this, as it makes it a lot easier. The less fluid my paint is, the easier it is for me to keep adding paint over the top of it. Also as well, I like to see the paint underneath, as I think this textured effect can be very interesting when dealing with background areas. I'm aiming for a bit of contrast between the thickness of my paint. In the crevice of the shadow, there is more paint, and then in the half shadow area, there is less paint. Generally, my backgrounds will carry less paint than my objects. It is just another way to introduce contrast into your paintings and help the viewer concentrate solely on the object. I have laid the foundations of my shadow. Next, I start to work on the area next to it because I will be using some of the paint that I have mixed up for my shadows and putting this into my fox. Remember that the background will be reflected in some way in the fox's fur, which is next to it. Objects take on the colours of their backgrounds, so by moving onto the fur, which is next to the floor, I can use the paints I have mixed up in my oranges. This is really how I work. I start from one area and gradually spread out across the painting. I do this because it makes it easier to incorporate my mixed paints into adjacent areas. I mix my paint as I go along. For those really dark areas, right in the crevice of the eye, I am using my ivory black and alizarin crimson. This is as dark as I can basically go. I cannot go any darker with any of my other colours than these two colours, and I use more black than I use alizarin crimson. Inside the crevice of the fox's eyes are the darkest area on this painting. And I did not use that black in any other area on this painting. You'll notice also around the eye, it is also very dark and could almost be mistaken for black as well. Do not use your black for the dark areas around the eye. You'll need to mix your rich black. And I vary the temperature of the colour depending upon what is next to it. So for example, in the dark areas around the eye, my rich black leans heavier towards blue because it is next to a browny orangey colour. I try to lay areas of similar colour and similar value at the same time. This is why I'm working on the areas around the eyes and ears. Notice how you can begin to see the obvious difference in my colours. So in my darks, you can see the blue leaning of the paint, and this pops against my oranges, even where I've added blue to my orange to neutralise it. It still looks orange against those shadows in that background. If I had only used black instead of my blue, I would have struggled to get such a contrast between the fox and the floor that he's lying on. Once I've laid a lot of my similar temperature value areas, I will start to move on to another area. I am just going to now show you a quick shot of my palette so you can see how my colour mixing develops from area to area. I just want you to see how organic my mixing is. As I move on to a new area, so I move on to another section of my palette, which is adjacent to the section that I have just been using. This way I can take paint from my previous area into my new area, and then I can adjust my new mix accordingly. The palette that I am using is a white gloss palette. I think they are called Posh palettes, and I got this one from Jackson's Art Supplies. I like them because they are easy to scrape back the paint mid-painting if you run out of room. They are also very easy to clean. I am not saying that you have to work exactly like me because I appreciate that we are all very different, and my methods may seem far too haphazard for somebody who likes to lay their paint out much more methodically. So what is important is that you take anything that you think is relevant from my process and try to incorporate it into your own. If something that I am doing doesn't work for you, don't try to keep doing it that way. Just adapt it or just disregard it and try another method. This is exactly what I have done with my process. I have watched many artists' processes and I have taken everything about their practice that works for me and incorporated it into my own practice. Anything that doesn't work, I have disregarded it. That doesn't mean that their method is wrong, it just means it didn't work for me. The person who probably I spent the most time painting with used to work with an underpainting method and then the glazing method over the top. I stuck with this method for about 5 years, but really struggled with it because my eye was too affected by a solid underpainting. The underpainting affected how I viewed every colour, and I would find when I was trying to paint anything realistically, I just couldn't get beyond the underpainting. But there were elements of that painting method that I really liked, and I incorporated as much as I could into this method that I now use. I would suggest, though, that you don't stick with anything that is working for you for as long as 5 years. I would say that 3 to 6 months is plenty of time to ascertain whether a method is working for you or not. So you can see that I am laying blocks and then trying to bridge across to these blocks. I would always suggest attempting anything that you are not sure about last, or at a point where you feel you have enough of the paint down to give yourself the best chance of getting as close as you can to it. By doing this, it will make it easier for you. The brushes that I am using are not majorly important on this layer. I tend to favour these flat Artmaster brushes. I find them a good workhorse for layers 1 and 2. I will speak in a bit more detail about brushes in next week's video because when I get onto layers 3 and 4, my brush selection becomes more important. I am just trying to get those 4 blocks that I showed you at the beginning of this video correct, because within those blocks are changes in colour and temperature, but if I can just get those 4 blocks established on layer 2, it will help me when adding the detail in layers 3 and 4. Obviously, you need to keep checking if your drawing is correct. So just keep standing back and viewing your painting next to your reference photo from about 3 to 4 meters. Looking at them side by side will help you see if your drawing is off. It is very easy with expressive painting to lose the correctness of your drawing. So if it starts to look wrong, I suggest starting with your drawing first and checking that it is correct. Also, when you lay the paint, make sure you are laying it in a way that follows the contours of the fox's form. So you will see very often the angle of how I lay the paint changes, depending upon the area that I am painting. I am trying to use my contour lines to help build form. Flat brushes are very good for helping you do this, which is probably why I'm very reliant on them in the first couple of layers. You will see that I am constantly going over areas that I have already done, adding a little more paint. Because the paint I have added has been very dry and scummed across the painting surface, it makes it easier to adjust these areas. If I was on a layer 3 or a layer 4, I would not be adjusting my areas because there would be too much paint on the canvas, resulting in the likelihood that I would lose control of the painting. At this point of the painting, because I am using such little paint, it is much easier to adjust in terms of value and temperature. You may have noticed also that I have left my lighter areas until the latter part of the painting. This is because my white paint is much more opaque than my other paints. Once I start adding that white, it is very difficult to work with if I have got it wrong. So because I know that my white paint, or anything mixed with my white paint, is harder to handle and control, I will always leave this until the latter part of the painting. The more information I have on that painting, the more likely I will be to get it correct the first time. Because I have a rough estimate of what I was looking at already laid down from my layer 1, it makes it easy for me to leave that area and for it to not affect how I view the rest of the painting. The more information that I get down on the canvas, the easier it becomes to judge the areas that I am out. And the painting is all about the colour shifts, and they are so subtle in some of the areas that the only way to really get them correct is just to keep working methodically on the whole painting and adding the areas that you are definitely sure about. And this is what I am doing. I am methodically working my way across the painting and building it up bit by bit. If you are struggling to see the colour shifts, there are two methods that you can use to try to help you. You can firstly hold a mid-grey card up to your reference photo. Ask yourself if the area that you are trying to paint is more blue, more red, more yellow than your card. The second method is to mix the colour that you think is correct and then to load a palette knife with this colour. Then hold it up to your reference photo and compare. I use both of these methods throughout this painting for areas that I was struggling to see what the colour was. Don't forget that the three primary colours mixed together will give you brown. So if you want a dark brown that is more orange based, I will use more blue, but I also mixed cadmium red and cadmium yellow to give me that vibrant orange. If I want a more muted brown, I have the option of using my alizarin crimson or my yellow ochre light. Both of these colours are much less saturated in colour than my cadmium red and my cadmium yellow, and so will give me a much more muted brown. But the blue controls how dark it is. If you want to lighten your brown, try adding one of your yellows first before you reach for your white. If this makes it too warm, you can always try adding green. My edges in this painting are really important. I don't want hard edges, for example, obvious fox, obvious background. I really want to try to lose some of those edges. By using a really big brush and pulling my paint into my fox, this helps knock out some of those edges. So that is layer 2 done. I hope you have found this video useful, especially if you are trying to paint along with it. Next week I will show you layer 3. So please like and subscribe to my channel if you can, and check out my website sarahhallidayart.com, where you will find examples of my work and details of classes that I run. Thank you for watching, and see you for the next one.